All right, we are ready to go, everyone.
was a
Thank you
business
so
man.
much
Shoot violins to
for
make it go away.
braving the cold rain
That makes
tonight.
sense, too.
Where we have programs at places like this, and if that bad weather hits, you think, oh no, no one's going to show up. And here you all are, so thank you so much for getting wet and coming out to the Rosenbach. I'm Edward Pennoni. I'm the manager of public programs here. Youth program guides here tonight, and I put all this together. Speakers, dramatic performances, we have music, we have courses, we have cocktail parties every month here.
Is there one tonight?
What's that? There's not, I'm sorry. We'll have to go to that one ourselves afterwards. So, and you're welcome back anytime to join us here for a program. This Sunday we have a program called the Poets of Fireside and Hearthside, reading together about race in America with John Greenleaf Whittier and Paul Lawrence Dunbar. We'll be reading 19th century poetry out loud, drinking hot cider, sitting around the mantle over there. Unfortunately, we can't light the fire, but you'll get the idea of how it'll be. It'll be a nice afternoon on Sunday, and then on Tuesday, the 19th next week, we have Emmett Till, a wonderful novelist from England who's coming over to tour and talking about his new novel, Friend of My Youth. And that'll be Tuesday night. Also tonight, if you haven't already been into the gallery next door to see, we have items from our collection set up to go along with some of the programs we do every season. So the items in the room next door in this gallery are connected to programs we have throughout this spring. And there's two items in there tonight that connect to the topic of tonight's panel. And one of which is a Dickens, one is a poem from Marion Moore called The Hero, and which deals with issues of, how you should commemorate people and how you should remember them, and are we remembering the right people? And we also have a Dickens letter in there, which was written to William Hepworth Dixon. And Dixon had asked Dickens for money for a monument for a naval war hero. And part of Dickens' response was, I have no faith in statues and no desire to help towards the remembrance of any man in that manner. The existing abominations in that wise fill my soul with grief and despair. I will be one of any committee to take any public statue down, but cannot be a committee man to set one up. Dickens wasn't a fan of statues. And we're in the city that has the only Dickens statue in the world for about 100 years. So, thanks for coming tonight. This is a collaboration with Drexel University's Pennoni Honors College. And to lead the panel tonight, who I will introduce here, please welcome Dr. Paul Morantz-Cohen, Distinguished Professor of English and Dean of the Pennoni Honors College. She's the author of 5 nonfiction books on literature, film, and culture, and 5 novels, including the one that I've read, Jane Austen in Boca, and the young adult novel, Beatrice Bunson's Guide to Romeo and Juliet. So please welcome Dean Cohen.
Well, thank you for being here, and I want to first say that everyone should turn their phones off. My people in the back told me to make sure to tell you, because we are filming this as a special episode of the Drexel Interview. I don't know whether you have caught this show, which is on WHYY on occasion, and which is also on public television stations throughout the country, various ones. So we are going to be filming this. It's going to go much longer than our usual show, but our wonderful Dragon Productions, who are here, students from Drexel, are going to edit the show down to the 26 minutes that we need to make it work for PBS. So anyway, I want to welcome you here and say that this is a first partnership with the Rosenbach. We're very pleased to be able to do this here. We usually do it at Drexel in one of our spaces, but this is so much more wonderful and beautiful, and we're very grateful to the Rosenbach for hosting us. So I will begin. And this is the camera, right? Okay. I'm Paula Morantz-Cohen, Dean of Drexel's Pennoni Honors College, here to host a panel on the topic, The Justice of Memory, Evaluating Monuments in a Changing Culture. This is a special episode of the Drexel Interview that we're broadcasting with a live audience from the Rosenbach, a brownstone in Center City, Philadelphia that houses a wonderful collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, furniture, and historical objects, and which also hosts programs like this one. Before we begin, let me take this opportunity to announce that in the coming months, we are transitioning the Drexel Interview into a new series that we are calling The Civil Discourse. This is an attempt to address important and often controversial issues with guests capable of speaking with clarity and civility across different viewpoints. Today's panel represents the first in this new series, and our panelists are three notable individuals from the Philadelphia community, and I'll introduce them now. Lorraine Carey, on my left, is an author, educator, and social activist. Her novels include the One Book, One Philadelphia selection, The Price of a Child, the story of a female fugitive from slavery. She also wrote the scripts for the videos on Independence Mall that interpret the lives of the 9 people enslaved in President George and Martha Washington's household. Jane Golden, over on the left, is the founder and driving force behind Mural Arts Philadelphia. Since 1984, Mural Arts has been the nation's largest public arts program and a global model for transforming public spaces and young people's lives through art. And finally, center stage here is Jonathan Zimmerman, a professor of the history of education at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school social studies teacher, Dr. Zimmerman is the author, among other books, of The Case for Contention, Teaching Controversial Issues in American Schools. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's begin by defining our terms, and I wonder if each of you could briefly tell me what you think a monument is.
Okay, well, so I think a monument is something that represents people, that represents ideas. I've learned that a monument doesn't have to be permanent, that it can be, as we saw in Monument Lab, it could be video, it could be, made of things that are more transitory, or a monument can be a mural, right? I used to think that a monument absolutely was a statue. But I think it is about representation, and it's about identity, and it's about what's important to us. It's about memory and history, how we see the city, how we see our lives, and what are those moments that are important to us that we want to see in public space. And that public, and how we define public is broad as well. I think that, in some ways, Monument Lab was the hardest project that we ever took on. It was so complex on many, many levels, and it was, I would say, a humbling experience as we got to listen to people all over the city about what a monument is, why they are really important.
Can you briefly tell us what Monument Lab was?
Monument Lab was a major exhibition that challenged Philadelphians to answer the question, what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? There were 2 esteemed curators, Ken Lum and Paul Farber, who are amazing, and we commissioned 20 works of art. They were in the 5 squares of Philadelphia and then in neighborhoods throughout the city. And they were really complex, deep, compelling, inspiring, evocative, challenging, difficult, all those things, as art should be.
So do either of you want to add to this
pretty
definition?
I think that's good.
Yeah.
The only thing, no, please.
No, I think that does it. The other bit about monument I learned was, in fact, through Mural Arts. We talked about monuments in Philadelphia and women. And were there monuments to women? And there were an amazing group of women who talked about what was appropriate, what was an appropriate way to memorialize women's lives. And was it the best thing to put a slab of stone up in the park?
Right. Yes.
I mean, the only other thing I'd say, without belaboring the obvious, is that monuments are pieces of history. There are ways that we define our community and its past. The Monument Lab is about contemporary Philadelphia, but its archive will be a historical archive. The items that Jane commissioned will be part of history and will become a text that allow people to look back and try to figure out how different communities represented themselves.
So do you feel that a monument can question the value of what it's representing? Or perhaps that's a rather fraught question, and we'll get to it as we continue. Maybe let's hold that for now. And I'll just ask you why this questioning of monuments seems to have be occurring at this present moment, and whether you know of any other times in history when this kind of question of taking down a monument or a group of monuments has been central to people's consciousness. Why now?
Because everything's crazy. I mean, it's an unbelievably polarized, fraught, and contentious time. I would say if you don't feel that in some way, you may be a sociopath. It is a deeply, deeply divided and contentious moment that we're living in. We've had them before, but part of the contention involves the very definition of who we are. So to me, it makes absolute sense that we'd be fighting over monuments, because that's a proxy for trying to figure out who we are as a people.
Yeah, in order for that to happen, there's a period of deconstruction, and so there's a breaking down of what we thought did represent us, but now as we start to re-examine what is equity, what is representation, what do these terms mean, it's like as a country, we're having an identity crisis, and it's good, and it's painful, and it's difficult, and it's hard, but these are questions that we have to be asking ourselves.
And who are we?
And who are we?
Because when we put up monuments, it wasn't all we. So that's part of what we're arguing.
Interesting. Okay, so you are assuming there's a deconstruction now, and there'll be a construction.
Well, there already is. I mean, Monument Lab is a construction.
That's true.
And the murals are an ever-evolving collection. I mean, in a way, it's like, you know, it was interesting. It was the Sharon Hayes who did the monument that was in Rittenhouse Square. It was a tribute to the lack of women in public art, and she brought a group of women together. And as people started to talk, and I was there just really sort of as an observer, and people spoke about the murals as monuments. They said, well, I can go around and I see myself on these walls, right? But I'm not sure I see that in the sculptures. And so it starts to, you know, and then how are we represented? But I think because we could come out of this process of trying to build a collaboration between the artist and the community, that you look at, I hope that people see the work as the autobiography of the city. At least that has been our intent.
So let's get to specific cases here. I'll give you 3, and I wonder what your response will be. Many of the most fraught cases have involved individuals that were linked to slave culture. I mean, we have other instances of controversy, but 3 that come to mind. A mural was taken down of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton University. Calhoun College at Yale, named after the strident pro-slavery politician John C. Calhoun, was renamed. Various Civil War monuments have been taken down in the South, with Confederate flags following suit in some cases. My question is, do you agree with all of these actions, some of these actions? Your thoughts about what else or what more you feel should be done? Lorraine.
I thought that one of the reasons why I was worried about coming onto this panel was because I don't know exactly.
Okay,
and
I think it's fine not to know.
And I thought, oh my gosh, I got to figure this out before, and I'm not sure. I'm not. Here's what I'm more interested in.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in creating monuments to people who were left out. I'm more interested in the energy of, there's a man named John Keane who's written a brilliant book called Counter Narratives. I'm interested in the energy, the repressed energy in our society that comes from keeping those other narratives quiet.
I want to get to that, the new narratives or the new monuments, but for the time being.
I know, with the taking down.
The taking down.
You didn't include the Frank Rizzo one.
Well, I'm going to get to Frank Rizzo, but I'm here. I'm talking
knew it.
about particularly
okay, I was
people
gonna bring it
involved
up.
with slave culture, and I wonder if are there some that you agree with, some you don't? Do you feel? I mean, what is your general positioning, if you have one? I mean, it's fine to if you don't feel you know. Jonathan, yeah.
Well, let me say that there's no serious historian that denies the fact that these monuments that you're referring to on the Confederate side are symbols of white supremacy. If you look at the record of when they were erected, most of them were put up not right after the Civil War, but during the era of Jim Crow. And the idea, quite specifically and deliberately, was to burnish slavery and to buttress segregation. That was the point. And again, I know it's a diverse country and there's some people that will disagree with what I just said, but there's really no credible historian now who does. So that's not an interesting question. Do they represent white supremacy? To me, the interesting question is what to do with them. And I would suggest that we may not be doing the cause of fighting white supremacy any help by removing them from our landscapes. Because I think that can create its own kind of forgetfulness. To me, the challenge is to try to recontextualize them so we learn from them. I think this debate, like so much in our society, has been polarized between people that say these are white supremacist symbols, get rid of them, and then people that say, oh no, they're just about states' rights, leave them. In my way of thinking, it's precisely because they are emblems of white supremacy that we have to find new ways to preserve them so we can teach everybody that history.
Well, in Russia, I'm just giving you an example of what was done with the Soviet statues of Stalin and so forth. They're put together in a museum, and there people can go and visit that history. But of course, that's isolated and partitioned. Do you feel that would be a good way to handle this? Obviously, it would create controversy, people who want them to stay, but what do you think of that as a solution, at least in some cases? Jane?
I don't know. I'm conflicted. Yes, I think that is somewhat of a solution because it's. I guess I have to admit I was nervous about coming here tonight because of the Rizzo mural. I feel in a way that's our Achilles heel because I really wanted it to go away.
The mural or the statue?
Well, the statue should go away.
I mean, you didn't do the statue.
No, we had nothing to do with it.
you didn't do
Thank God. We had nothing to do with
the
the
mural
statue.
person.
But the mural was done under anti-graffiti, and it wasn't my decision, and it was a decision of the good administration, and
Did it occur to you at the time, or was it?
It seemed like a really bad idea, and I said to my boss at the time, this is a really bad idea, and he said, well, we did a portrait of Wilson Good, and we've just got a petition with 3,000 names from South Philly, and Wilson Good says it's the fair thing to do. So I was like, I haven't been in Philly very long, but this seems like this seems like not a good idea. But we went up, and every year someone would write fascist on it. We'd take it off, and I'd just be like, when is someone going to build a condo in front? I can't believe I'm saying this on television, in front of the mural. And so it didn't happen, and then there's the election of Trump, and then everything becomes very volatile, and then we're sort of under greater pressure to do something, and so we convene people, we do a poll, and it's like there are a lot of people who wanted to stay, and there are a lot of people who wanted to go. Talk about it was like.
And then there's also the question of whether Frank Rizzo was a racist or not. I just spoke to someone today, a very high-level person who was on the Philadelphia Inquirer, who knew him very well, and said to me he was not a racist. And so, I mean, again. Then I've heard other people say the opposite. I didn't know him. I don't know how you.
But do we keep it? Do we keep it? So the building owner, the parking lot owner, and the artist wanted to stay. Legally, we can't do anything. What we'd like to do is put it in context, to do signage so that people can read about him in all his complexity, and that it can be some kind of lesson. Now, can we put a sign up there? That's a whole other drama. But, I mean, do I feel it's important to contextualize who this man was and what happened in his administration, that we can learn from it? Who do we want to lead our city? I think that those are really important questions that we should grapple with and struggle with.
I think it's also true that we don't, this question of is somebody a racist, and then therefore what? Well,
and what does that
about
mean?
White supremacy? And what? I mean, the United States of America was built on white supremacy. George Washington, Jefferson, it was built
That's right.
specifically on the idea that these people who were landed gentry were the correct and proper people to lead the country. That's the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that we're going to pick and choose and say these people were white supremacists and these people were, it just feels to me like a false.
See,
So
I
you're
agree.
getting
I agree
closer to-
completely with you, and I
But-
came to. Go ahead.
No.
I just got excited.
No, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say
mean,
that.
But are you getting closer in saying that to what you really think about this whole thing as you're speaking?
Getting closer to what I really think.
What-
You
well-
want to know what I really think?
No,
Because we can go right
no,
to
you
what
said
Don't
you're
hold
very
back. Don't hold
you
back.
said you're
Right.
ambivalent about the taking down or the leaving up. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, and when you're saying this, is this slippery slope sort of thing about should we take it all down? Should we change all the names? What you're saying is it's built on
Right.
this premise.
Right.
So where do we stop and how do we, it's about teaching history properly, isn't it?
I think we're fighting because we're fighting about changing today. Mm-hmm. We're fighting about, as we have over and over and over, we're fighting about power and access to power and access to full citizenship in the United States. And we fight about it, and then there's clawback, and we push forward, this is what we do. I would rather we talk honestly about the way we fight, and that in the best of times we fight politically.
Yeah.
In order to keep from doing what we did to each other at Gettysburg and on Fort Pillow and all that. I would so much like to talk about it honestly and say,
Yes, I agree.
And make the discussion about behavior and action, not about character.
Right, I actually wanted. That's right.
Whether
Yes.
Frank Rizzo was a racist, I neither know nor care, right?
Yeah.
What I do know about is the way that Frank Rizzo both ordered and okayed brutal behavior by the police against African Americans and also against gay Americans in the city, right?
Right.
That I know. What was in his soul and whether he was a racist or not, I leave that to
I
God.
guess when someone tells me that, they mean that they understand the context in which he was doing these things.
Right.
But no, I agree. That's a good distinction. What did he actually do?
Right.
And but also,
Because
what
that-
was the
that we can-
what was
we-
the
we can
period? What were
shorten
other
and-
people doing at that time as well? What was the
Right.
the social and political context of the period?
And we have lots of murals of people who are complex. And are you going to start saying, well, that person actually did this and this person did this? I mean, we're flawed as human beings. So you start
Yeah.
there. But then I think.
What did the Rosenbachs do? I don't know. Just asking. Yeah.
We haven't dug into that
Yeah,
yet.
But what I wanted for the Rizzo mural,
Yeah.
my aspiration
Yeah.
was that we could bring people together to have a conversation about who we are now as a city. That's my deepest desire. I wanted I wanted something new there that we could somehow have this conversation.
And I think this conversation is part of the process. But I want to give you 3 other examples of things that I think are interesting. One is the Rizzo statue. Andrew Jackson was going to be taken off the $20 bill and replaced by Harriet Tubman. The flag of Mississippi, which contains the Confederate flag, was repealed at one point, but is still in de facto use. And I should say the Andrew Jackson has not been taken off the $20 bill. As the statue of Frank Rizzo in front of the Municipal Services Building was voted to be taken down, but that has been put on hold. So I wonder about these 3 instances. In all 3 cases, the judgment was to change. Mm-hmm. The action has been to leave it alone. And I wonder if that reflects something. Whereas there's a symbolic decision to do something, and then, in fact, it's sort of forgotten and not done. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, it strikes me in the case of Jackson and Tubman, it's a deliberate snub on the part of the Trump administration. Trump has very openly embraced Andy Jackson and put his portrait next to him, and also radically misrepresented him by saying at one point, if we had listened to Andy Jackson, there wouldn't have been a civil war. Even though Andy Jackson was involved in the Indian Wars, and it was a quarter century earlier, but never mind.
Facts.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, I mean, I'm sure there are people here that know more about this than me. Now it's in the hands of Steve Mnuchin, because he's the Treasury Secretary.
So you think the next Democratic administration, it's going to happen?
That would be what. That seems to be the pattern.
I would
Okay.
agree with you.
So it's
Yeah.
it's the political climate of the moment. The Rizzo statue, I'm not quite sure.
Money is something you can change. So you can change it. You can take turns. We've had Jackson for a while. I've used a lot of 20, as many as I could use.
Yeah.
We could have somebody else on it.
How about
for
some
a while.
Tubmans now?
That's what I felt about Ninth and Montrose. I felt like it's time.
It's all about the
Yeah.
Tubmans.
Well, your point that monuments can be ephemeral.
And they can evolve over time.
Right.
Yeah.
But whereas a statue doesn't in the same way.
It's static.
It's static unless you move it around and put things around it, or do performances
videos around it.
Put
Yeah.
videos around it, stage things there.
I loved when the Afro pick was about 20 feet from the sculpture of Frank Rizzo. Did you see that? That was part of Monument Love, Hank Willis Thomas.
I loved watching what people did when they approached it, because it made people who normally ignore a monument, it made them respond to it
Yes.
as if there's art here. Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
wow, and then they talk.
Yeah, the day we unwrapped it, it was incredible discourse all day long.
But see, I think we need some people as creative as my co-panelists here to address this Confederate monument problem in creative ways. So when Silent Sam was first pulled down at UNC, imagine if they had just left him there.
Pulled down.
Yeah, left him
Yeah.
on the ground, cordoned it off with context and explanation. Then you would have a visual story, right, of what happened, right? Who this represented, why they were pulled down, right? But people would see the story instead of out of sight, out of mind, right? I've taken a lot of heat on this subject for suggesting things like this, and people say, well, it's such a racist thing. How could you ever have it at UNC? You know what? The UNC history will still be racist whether Silent Sam is there or not.
Right, but
And
I agree
if
with
you're,
you. Yeah.
if you're a historian, you cannot abide by the removal of items of the past. Obviously, as times change, we need to think more about their context. But I think that was a great lost opportunity, frankly. Imagine just Silent Sam there on the lawn. He's still there, but he's been toppled. And everyone would see and know why.
The problem, Jonathan, is that you would have the pushback then, and people would put it back up. Then it would be pulled down. Of course, that would be the narrative.
But to advocate for creativity, like I think one of my favorite Monument Lab projects, there's a war memorial in Vernon Park, and the artist wrapped it in a material that's like a mirror. So instead of seeing a war memorial, you saw yourself.
Oh, right,
I mean, just
right,
like how
right.
wonderful was that,
Don
right?
Camp did that with a picture of Emmett Till. So and as you walk by the mirror, your own face you see your features behind the features of Emmett Till. Right?
Yeah.
Vander Kolk, who's a trauma specialist, says that his first work with PTSD was a soldier who was having terrible nightmares. He gave him some pills. The man came back, and he said, well, how are your nightmares now? And he said, well, I couldn't take your pills because if I don't have the nightmares anymore, it means I'm forgetting the men who died with me. And Vander Kolk said that, so he understood that his own suffering was a monument to the men who died with him. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we do monuments in our own lives that can teach all of us about collectively how we represent what we feel. Or, Sigmund Freud saying that this man is suffering from memory. Right, you are. Yeah.
Well, I thought maybe each of you could talk a little bit about your involvement with this. And starting with Jane, you already mentioned the Rizzo mural, but I wonder if there is there another instance of a figure that has caused controversy, or a mural that is problematic and that has caused difficulty in the community, and what's your thought about it, besides the Rizzo?
Well, I mean, we've had murals that that have been, I mean, there's nothing, I mean, I want to say that's like an aberration. I mean, we have thousands of works of art that don't, I mean, that has really been incredibly complex with, and now, as of today, with our answer being city funds won't restore it anymore, raise the money to keep it up, and we're going to put signage up and try to contextualize it. But I'd say for the most part, we're looking at a collection of 4,000, so really.
That's amazing in a way, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Because now I'm wondering if the process, do you think more about it than you did before because you think, well, this could be controversial or this could raise problems in this community and so forth in a way you didn't before?
Well, I think we're not going to do anything because of the way we work. Nothing is going to go up. Like, I think people have more control over the public art than they do over the condo that's going to suddenly appear down the street, and you go, what happened? So because we have excessive community meetings, we do.
Before you decide. I don't know what your process is.
We meet with the community. I mean, sometimes art creates community, sometimes community creates art, but it's very rare that, I mean, it's not like our style to just show up and do something. So that would be, that just really doesn't happen. So, but I will cite two complicated projects. A project in Kensington where we were doing was about the impact of, there was a spike in juvenile crime. And so it was about that impact on young people's lives, and it was about sort of innocence, struggle, and sort of triumph. And when we did it, we thought we had community support. We obviously didn't, and we got 3/4 of the way through this beautiful mural. It's almost a quarter of a mile long, so I'm talking about a major work of art. And I got an anonymous call, and someone said, "You're going to be really surprised when you go down there, and you're going to see the wall. That mural is whited out because we hate it." And I was like, "What?" And they said, "We thought you were going to give us a happy mural. Instead, we got a polemic, and that isn't what we wanted." And so I met with a group of people, and I realized we had tapped into a pretty deep chord of racism. And I'm not actually really good at this. Like, I realize, like if you make a point, I'll make a point. You make a point, I'm not going to like ever work for the UN, right? I'm not going to solve this. So my husband is like, "You really need a mediator." So we found a Quaker mediator, and we had meeting after meeting with hundreds of people, screaming and yelling, and it was such a difficult experience. And finally, this one woman stood up at one of the meetings and she said, "Our neighborhood never comes together around anything. Can you believe we're coming together around art?" Then a young woman who was 14 stood up and she said, she looked at the people, and the mediator was clever. She isolated the opposition as being the smaller group. The people who wanted it were the larger group, but the small group was difficult. And this young woman said, "My mother died of a heroin overdose, and I have never felt better than I have working on this project. Oh. And shame on you adults for bringing all this sort of turmoil." And finally, people said they wanted to negotiate. So we had this negotiation, and there had been a man in the neighborhood who had been a police officer, a troubled kid, became a police officer, then went to Iraq, he fought, and he died, but he was really charitable. They said, "Can he go on the mural?" And we're like, "Sure." And then we actually had a conversation with who from the neighborhood could actually be in that mural. At the same time, I heard on NPR this professor, a theology professor who had been in Bosnia, and he said, "The hardest thing for human beings to do is to understand another person's perspective. But when you do, you enter into what I'm going to call a state of grace." Mm-hmm. And I have to say that mural was as close to a state of grace as ever in my 30 years of doing this work, because the dedication was attended by hundreds of people who had just been at each other. And somehow the work became a beacon for what was possible.
That's a great story. So everyone supported it in the end.
In the end.
That's great.
It's a Lehigh and Aramingo.
But see, this is precisely the sort of democratic deliberation that wasn't present, right, in the erection of so many of these older monuments.
That's right.
That's the point.
That's right.
But of course, it's hard, it's time-consuming, it's fraught, it's not always successful, but it should be done. But it's hard to do.
It's messy,
Well,
like
it's
democracy.
messy.
is.
What else do we have to do?
No, I agree.
It's messy, but
We don't
democracy,
do
you're
it,
right.
and then we need to talk to each other.
So I want to move on to Jonathan and ask him, because you've taught social studies to middle school students. And I'm wondering, history, as we're discussing it here, is so complex, and students of that age are not necessarily able to, well, you may disagree, but they tend to not get nuance as well as the more mature brain. And I wonder how you have or would deal with some of these issues in a middle school classroom or with younger students for whom things tend to be more polarized, more black and white?
Look, I think that's true, but I also think that sometimes we patronize kids a little bit by imagining that they can't do this. I would say what we've seen in the past couple of years is the adults in the room are having a hard time with us. You know, the adults in the room are painting the world in radically black and white ways. And it's the adults in the room that have a feed on their phone that brings them in, quote, information only from the team that they voted for, right? That lights up all the pleasure centers by telling them how bad the other team is.
Yeah, the kids are not yet immersed in that
Correct.
bubble, so to speak.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, in the Fox News and MSNBC
Right.
war. So in some ways it strikes me that that's an opportunity, you know, because the scary thing to think about is when they turn on the TV and they see, you know, a debate is going to be on about immigration, and what they see are just three people ranting at each other, not actually having any kind of exchange. Unless we try to teach our kids another way, that's what they think democracy is. Right?
People yelling at each other.
Exactly. With no shared empathy or humanity, right? With utter vilification and dismissal of the other side. The sort of give and take and democratic deliberation that Jane was just describing is largely absent in the kind of cable news I'm describing. And unless we try to teach our children a different way, that's what they're going to think democracy is.
Well, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about as a teacher, and I guess, well, the three of us, and Jane, you've taught, or you sort of teach, you teach your, that the classroom is the place where this happens, where we can hear different voices. Once you get out of the classroom and go to your job or whatever, there's no forum for that kind of discourse. And that's a problem, but it also gives us an opportunity because we can have those discussions with students and then send them on their way.
Right,
So.
and look, these things are fraught for all the reasons that we're talking about. But, you know, I think our young people know that this is a tense time, and they're looking to us as educators to provide a forum where they can discuss some of this in an environment that isn't so mutually hostile.
Right.
And I think the challenge is creating that environment right now. And making it clear to our students that there have to be a set of ground rules for how all this occurs, and that they are absolutely entitled to whatever belief that they would like. It may not be the teacher's belief, but they also have to abide by certain standards of behavior, certain ground rules that unfortunately we see flouted all around us. It's not just the fault of he who shall not be named. It's true that he's the president, right? And that makes him in some ways the greatest danger, but the second greatest danger is all of us imitating him. All of us. In the dismissive and hostile way that we speak about those with whom we disagree.
Well, that's well said. And finally, Lorraine, I want to ask you about your work because you did contextualize the George Washington's household with these videos. You did the scripts for the videos that are there on Independence Mall. And I wonder about the process. How did that come about? Is this duplicatable? Is this the kind of thing, this kind of contextualization that you did, that you see as a way to educate the public? And how difficult is it? How expensive is it? How time consuming is it?
I will say that my work and the work of the director Louis Messiah, who runs Scribe and who taught me enormous amount about writing for these little, you know, I always call them history commercials, you know, they're teeny little short bits. And the idea is you should be able to walk past on the way to the bathroom and you only get a bit, but you get something. Or you also get something if you stand there and you watch each of them and proceed around the entire exhibit. But we were not brought onto this project until a group of people. It was a public group. They were curated. They demanded. They wanted us to be on that group. So we listened to them. There was a wonderful woman from the Smithsonian who said in our small group, there was a historian who had, he and his wife had a production company, and they'd done Slavery in New York, that exhibit at the New York Historical Society. There was Emmanuel Kelly was the architect, Louis and I, and this Smithsonian historian said to us, there are people who don't know as much history as you do, who can still tell you something about how best to depict it. And that felt to me like, listen, you know, people are shouting, people are angry, people are saying things that maybe you don't believe. Maybe there's no proof of what they're saying. Maybe they haven't sat and read every one of George Washington's pages in his thing about that he finally brought somebody up from the South, and very quickly he was spending $2 to put decent clothing on them because he didn't want his enslaved people to look poor, as in fact they were. And you know, he wanted to get them all buffed up when they came to Philadelphia to show off. You know, so people in this group hadn't read all that, but they still had things that I needed to listen to and then decide whether I thought that representation was true, and if so, how to represent it. We had a very robust discussion amongst ourselves about the 9 people who were enslaved on that spot, you know, and through that time. There were some folks on the group who said, make a collage. Like, we don't know enough actual facts about each enslaved person. So you could do something where, you know, you have one person who says something to another person, and that sort of represents kind of what we expect they would say. And Louis and I sat for hours arguing it.
So it was a very long process.
It's a very long process where we decided, no, we're going to use their names. We don't ever do a monument that says Washer Jefferson with one guy with a wig. It's not, that's disrespectful. You know, they had their own. So we figured, who are these 9? What do we know? What can we prove? What can we find out?
Are you working on anything else like this?
Right now?
Or can you see yourself doing something else? Is there another project you have in mind?
I love playing with genres in order to get at stuff. So I am working on a play about Harriet Tubman. And the play gives you an opportunity to do different things. I'm finished a memoir about taking care of my grandmother. But the stuff I found out was that her father brought them here from North Carolina because of Jim Crow. So I found all this stuff that she hadn't talked about, mostly I think because of the shame of his losing all his money in the Depression. But in fact, I discovered that he had been the secretary for the last African American in Congress for 20 years, the last black congressperson from North Carolina for 90 years. Why didn't I know this? This is my own great grandfather. I didn't know this.
Well, you're talking about memoir and fiction. You write fiction and other forms of artistic expression, and I wonder if we could segue for a moment into those and your thoughts about problematic expressions in those areas. And I'm thinking particularly about actors, about particularly Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby. Do we watch their movies? Do we watch their shows? Do we think about, I mean, it's akin to what we're saying in a way about monuments. What are your thoughts on this?
Who was the biggest anti-Semite? We still listen to Wagner. Wagner was a horrible anti-Semite. Horrible.
So was Ezra Pound.
So
and
was,
T.S.
well,
Eliot.
let's do the list.
Yeah.
It's a long
Dickens
list.
wasn't
It's a
so
long
great
list.
himself.
Dickens wasn't. Yeah.
But yes, that's true. But then if we go back to, where do we draw the line? I mean, where do they become egregious, and where is it? Well, it was in the climate of the day. This is how people thought. I struggle with this. I don't know. Henry James is my idol, but Henry James was not perfect.
I guess, I would just say two things. First of all, I'm not a huge fan of this is how people thought, because that's not how everybody thought.
Amen.
Right?
Right.
When my students say, well, that's what people thought slavery was okay. I'm always like, hold on, which people? Frederick Douglass? Like, did he think it was okay? Like, did William Wood Garrison think it was okay? Like, which people are we talking about? And during all of Wagner's anti-Semitic screeds, there were plenty of people criticizing him for those screeds, right? But the second thing I would say is the answer is not to remove Wagner. To me, that's just ahistorical and ahumanist. Was Wagner an awful Jew hater? Yes. But what cause of justice is served by simply eliminating him? We need everybody to know who he was. Wiping him out of our consciousness will not serve that purpose.
So every time there's a performance, we should say, this is an anti-Semite, but he wrote great music.
I mean, seriously, what would be wrong with that? Because both of those claims are true.
It's right.
His anti-Semitism does not erode the quality of his music, right?
But learning about his anti-Semitism changed the way I listened to it.
It changed it for me.
And it changed the way I thought about our project of understanding the good, which always triumphs over the bad.
Definitely.
And so it changed my whole way of listening to that, and also, therefore, the way I'm thinking of making my art.
But none of those changes would have ever happened if we had simply obliterated Wagner.
For sure. Can I show my stuff now?
Sure.
I just wanted to, in case, I wanted to pass these out.
Fantastic.
These are, everybody, many of this group has
Would you
seen it.
just tell for
These
our
are the
audience?
Yeah. So the New York Times has a whole project of obituaries they're calling overlooked. And there are all kinds of, this is for February. These are African Americans who did amazing things and whose obituaries were never in the Times. And now the Times is publishing this. Wonderful young woman I know is working on it about Veronica.
It is a wonderful project, yeah.
It is.
It's sort of,
It's a great
yeah,
project.
it's inspiring.
Yeah.
So I want to perhaps end this section of the program here. I do want to say that this kind of conversation strikes me as what is needed, but to happen everywhere, certainly to happen in classrooms, both at the younger level and in the college classroom. And I'm sure those of us that are teachers have this. I'm teaching Othello right now, for example, at Drexel, in the community with my students, and it is the most illuminating. The thing about Shakespeare is he always saw around everything. He both expressed his culture and he critiqued his culture at the same time in ways that are astounding. So teaching that play is a way of addressing all these issues. And I think if we can find the right text, the right works to discuss in the classroom, we address these subjects. And that's where my hope lies. So I want to say to our audience, our live audience, thank you for being here. And to our television audience, thank you for joining us today. Brian, was that okay? Because I was told to do this, and now we're going to open to questions. Some of the questions will be, I will repeat the question with the possibility that we will include this in the final episode. Yes?
I would like to ask a question. You talked about things you don't like. I would ask each of the panelists to tell us a monument that's over 50 years old. Over 50 years old, that you personally like or love.
Okay, let me repeat.
Anywhere in the world.
Let me repeat the question. The question is, can each of our panelists mention a monument over 50 years old anywhere in the world that they like or love or admire? Lorraine.
The first thing that jumps into my mind is a lot of architecture, religious architecture that so I'm not speaking of one thing like a monument, and maybe I should, but that's, so Church of the Advocate at 18th and Diamond Street. I love the building, I love the little stone carvings, I love the little faces of children that are carved around the baptistry. And I think it's about 50 years ago that Black Arts murals were installed in the place. So you get this feeling, Peter Rockwell talked about being in there and feeling as if it was a building that had grown and lived and managed to talk about worship through time with its different people.
The Lincoln Memorial. I mean, I know he's sort of stern and scary sitting up there, but the Lincoln Memorial, because of the way that it's been reinterpreted across time, because of the way that successive generations have seized upon it to remind ourselves about freedom. You have Marian Anderson singing in front of it. You have Martin Luther King giving his most famous piece of oratory in front of it. And so it isn't just the bricks and mortar, as it were, right? It's the historical record of the way different people have invoked and invested in it.
I'd say the Sistine Chapel, to stand there, you feel the spiritual nature of sort of the art, the beauty, the grand feeling of it. I think that you feel so it's such a strong feeling about the power of art that it's almost overwhelming.
Isn't it funny? And when we were there at the Sistine Chapel, what we felt was how did, we loved it. I loved it. I loved the teeny little, there were nuns in blue who wouldn't look, they had mirrors. So they walked around because they wouldn't look at the grandeur of it. Like all of this was
Why?
happening.
Because it was too it's sacrilegious to look.
See, yeah, I could only understand a little
That's so
of the
interesting.
English, but it was,
Yeah.
but all I could think of was, this is all for this, a first century Jew who said love each other, and where did all this wealth come from? Like it just.
There
And
you
I
go.
kept thinking, how did he paint it?
There you go. And all the oppression in the name of religion.
Yes, look at the brush strokes.
You got it,
Right?
Yeah, really.
Yes.
My question is for Dr. Zimmerman. You brought up that it's important to teach the context of monuments and to not simply remove them from the public consciousness and the public space. And I think that hasn't been the case in history with all kinds of polarizing statues and throughout history. In contemporary Germany, they don't leave the swastika flag up, although it was very prominent throughout the history of the country,
Right.
beginning of the 40s. But
Right.
I think, or would you not agree that there's a place for these monuments in a textbook?
Let me repeat the question
Yeah,
so
please
that
do.
we have it. The point that some monuments, like in Nazi Germany, the swastika certainly isn't there. That has a place in textbooks, but not to be left standing. And so the question is, where do you draw the line, essentially?
Is there not just a place for these things in textbooks? Do they need to be?
Physically present.
I
Physically
see.
present.
Do they need to be physically
Well,
present?
I would say not necessarily in their place of origin, right? But they are historical texts. They are, and I'm sure you know more about Germany than I do, but there are museums where you can go and you can see all the iconography of the Third Reich. And I'm glad of that. You know, even though those symbols are hateful and hurtful, I don't think they should only be in a book. They certainly shouldn't be celebrated in the way they were during the Third Reich. But it's precisely because of their horror that we have to preserve them. And it isn't easy, but we have examples of it in this country. So Silent Sam came down, right, at UNC and now is in some undisclosed location. But at UT Austin, with Jefferson Davis, they put him in the Briscoe Center. They put him in the History Center with a very elaborate display about the history of the monument. And that's really important, right? Where did this thing come from in the first place? Then who started to object? Then what was the deliberation surrounding it, right? Indeed, a kind of record of the debate and the controversy over the item itself. So you don't have it in the center of campus saying, you know, welcome to UT, here's the president of the, you know, the slave-holding society that seceded, all right? But you do put it in a public place so people can go and think about it.
Yes.
We took down, we Americans went to Iraq, and one of the things we loved to see over and over again was
Saddam coming down. Yeah.
pulling down Saddam.
Yeah.
And it felt to me like there's power, and we go in and we say we have more power. It feels to me like, you know, they're there again. Like,
But I think in fairness, it was Iraqis that pulled it down.
Yeah.
It was Iraqis.
Yeah.
Did we help?
Yeah,
I saw
at some level, I'm
yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we helped. We made it happen. But that's a good point. Yeah.
I actually want to relate an anecdote about that very pulling down of the Hussein statue. A friend of mine who is Palestinian by birth and listened to the audio and understood the Arabic said two things. First of all, the people who were shouting, pulling the statue down, did not have Iraqi accents. They were foreigners. And number two, the flag that they pulled out and put up was kind of not the appropriate old Iraqi flag. So he interpreted that whole scene as a charade put on by the Americans or the alliance.
Interesting.
So I think that is a really interesting cautionary tale. I can't vouch for its truth, but I think there's part of me that says, pull them down, you know, what the heck? But we have to be careful that we don't make pulling them down, whatever them is, another assertion of a different inappropriate power.
And it's interesting you bring this up. When I was in Russia, I spoke to quite a number of older people who did not hate Stalin and felt that Stalin was responsible for their being saved during World War II. And so this mixed inheritance or this mixed legacy attached to some of these figures makes it, because if you put the figure in a place that is a place of negativity, you know, which is what you're suggesting, certainly for Hitler and that stuff, you're saying already this is all bad, right? Whereas the mixed nature of people, and I'm just, since so many people aren't just horrible, they're mixed.
Right.
How do you tease that apart? How do you make that available to the
Right. I
public?
mean, during the Frank Rizzo, during the drama of this a year ago, I mean, people said, you know, well, what if we went and we're just going to take down the Malcolm X mural? And it was horrifying to me. I was like, what? But it's sort of, you know, how do we look at public space and who are we ceding power to? I mean, there are a lot of questions with this. And also, like, there's a huge collection of work around the city, and like developers build in front or tear things down, and communities feel like, and then people say, well, actually, we don't want the Stop the Violence mural there. This community is different now. We want something different. And they're like, different? Who says it's different? This one woman stood up at a community meeting a few weeks ago and said, when murals go away, we feel like our lives are being erased. So who gets to make that decision? So that Stop the Violence mural at 20th and Tasker is going back up, and we want it back up. Because we want, even though it's a Stop the Violence mural. And part of me feels like, well, do you really want to stop the violence mural? But they're attached to it. And I feel like it's the long-standing residents have a stake in it, how they're represented. But you start to make those it is.
Right.
But that's a sort of a slippery slope of how we make decisions.
When I go by Bainbridge and 10th, there's a lovely, just a scene.
It's 10th and it's a crystal snowscape.
Right, the crystal snowscape. I remember that Cato was killed right near there. And I look at that scene and I make a little, tongue tripping, and I walk by it. Because I feel like it doesn't say that. Now, I didn't come to any of your meetings about what should go up there. But
It's good they went on a long time.
But I am sure that that we all have relationships to what's represented. And the structure, not just the individuals, but the structure at the time that made the working of this individual crucial to making terrible things happen, making amazing things happen, making change happen, making status quo happen. Like they're proxy for that, the structure of that.
And I think actually the Malcolm X example is an opposite one, because there's some people that read the autobiography of Malcolm X and they see a certain kind of misogyny, they see a certain kind of anti-Semitism. I understand these are controversial claims, but you're the English scholar, you can read this in different ways. But I can accept that, but I don't think those are good reasons for taking down his mural. He was a man in full, and that means he was an imperfect man. He also changed radically over his own lifetime. And I would hate for him to be judged by the most negative passages of that book or any book.
Yes.
I had some people over here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not looking in this direction, but this.
Well, but you mentioned Harvey Weinstein, so the state of Virginia.
First Ralph Northam reference. It's only 7:15.
But I mean, it's with those three men, we have everything, and it's a political problem. It's a representational problem. They were all elected by the will of the people. So what do we do with them?
And is this a function of, you say that not everybody thought a certain way, but within certain people, young men brought up in a certain context, will have have had certain thoughts and perhaps should be allowed to evolve from there? Do we allow that, or do we not allow that? Do we say that someone who did something at 17 is going to be stuck in that place?
Northam was past 17.
That's true. He was in medical school. Forget what I was
graduating.
I guess I'm confusing him with Kavanaugh.
There are 17-year-olds in jail. And
yeah.
there are 17-year-olds in jail, and there are 17-year-olds who have made great decisions. Lots of them in tough circumstances.
That's right.
But I think it is structure. So I think we've had a structure that nurtures and allows and says to people, this doesn't matter so much.
So it's like,
Don't
okay,
worry about
that's
it.
right.
Don't worry about it.
Let me go over to this side. Yes.
I'm thinking also of monuments that are not necessarily works of art. I'm thinking of the Berlin Wall. That's a monument to a piece of history. And the destruction, the elimination of the Berlin Wall was a focus for generations, really, and was so critically important. And yet, I am sure, I know there are still pieces of the Berlin Wall that are up. There are pieces, sections that are still standing. There are pieces of it that are commercialized and people buy and want to come home with. And it's a totally different response. But it should not go away. And it should not be put in a museum. I think it should stand where it is, a piece of it at least.
Or some of it, sure.
Or some of it, yeah.
Right, because people also have to know what it looked and felt like, so they can try to do the imagination work of, all the people that risked their lives to try to challenge it, right? And without those sorts of visual representations, that's just going to be way harder. It will just be, quote, something in a book. And look, I write books.
Of course you could say that, too, about Jefferson on a horse, or, it's very hard to separate.
It's easier with a broken down wall,
Yeah.
isn't
Wall
it?
is-
But it
wall
gets
is
back to your
easier.
point about a statue that might be pulled down and that could remain in place as
that's
such.
right.
How many
Yeah.
moments in history when these statues,
But we
Right.
couldn't,
every moment in history has a statue coming.
Yes, yes, and sometimes the same one will come down and go up. So seriously, my family and I lived in Ghana in 2008, and if you go to the Kwame Nkrumah Memorial, one of the things you see is this kind of half-reconstructed a statue of Nkrumah, which is missing an arm, and it's not like a Venus de Milo thing, right? I mean, there was a coup against Nkrumah, and they destroyed the statue, and then they, after Rawlings came in, who kind of wanted to bring tie himself to Nkrumah, what he did was he found different pieces of the old Nkrumah statue and he just patched it up, and there he is again, it's without an arm. Yeah.
but we also keep the forts, and we keep Auschwitz.
That's right. I was going to say
Yeah.
bring that up.
Yeah, and there are tours of
That's
Yes,
exactly.
of the
That's
fort.
right.
yes.
So some of you have talked about an evolving social and historical context for much of the events that have been described. And I'm curious about your reaction to this. About 2 years ago, the Philadelphia Bar Association, a section of it, had a debate about a person named Andrew Hamilton. Now, Andrew Hamilton was the lawyer from Philadelphia who, in the middle of the 17th century, rode on horseback. He was 60 years old at the time, to defend John Peter Zenger, one of the great trials, one of the great victories for freedom of the press. And for a long time, the Philadelphia Bar Association, since he did this free, gave this award to lawyers who acted on a pro bono basis, giving up their time. Then it was discovered that Andrew Hamilton had been a slave owner. And there was a debate about whether the Bar Association ought to have an award given after a slave owner. And the debate went back and forth, and he died in 1710 or 1720, somewhere along those lines. And it was considered important that when he died, he did not free his slaves. So we're now talking 1710, talking about the 17th century. And there was a debate and a vote on whether his name should be taken off the award. Thoughts?
What happened?
Well, I thought I'd have your
Oh,
thoughts
I
on
see.
it.
Then will you tell us the
Yeah.
right answer?
The right answer, yeah.
I'll give you the answer.
These things are so hard.
I'll tell you, my first thought was that someone who owned people and got wealth from their work gives me a different spin on doing something pro bono.
Huh.
So he did it free, but him doing it free is not the same as someone who did not profit from other people's labor doing something free.
I wouldn't want his name on the award. I wouldn't want to get that award. It would make me uncomfortable. Is that being too micromanagey?
What, do you have other thoughts?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, wait, he didn't tell us.
What
Are we
happened?
still?
Yeah.
Well,
No,
this
no,
is-
You're talking
are you
about
going to
the
respond to
National
him?
Bar Association.
Oh.
Yeah, I'd like to
Yeah.
hear from my lawyer first, if
Yeah.
I may.
Maybe I could give this example and you could share.
Okay.
How do you feel about a former slave owner being memorialized on the top of City Hall of the
Oh, yeah.
fifth largest city in the United States? Hall, that at the intersection of Market Street, then called High, and Front Street, there was a establishment called the London Coffee House,
Right.
which served as a market, of a place of exchange of human beings, Africans, who would be sailed up to Delaware and would be purchased, put up for sale. And one of the purchasers lived 2 blocks away. The name was William Penn. And so, how do we figure both of these out? Because you wouldn't take it out of Alexander Hamilton. But I don't see anybody, parading around City Hall saying, "Wow, this guy was, worse than Rizzo."
She talked about it on the Twitter.
Well, that may yet come, right?
I think we have to ask ourselves some honest questions about what impels these sorts of campaigns, okay? Look, I understand the case against Andrew Hamilton. I read about it, but to me there's a little bit of, not just a little bit, a lot of kind of posturing and value signaling in this sort of behavior. Oh, God forbid I have any association with this terrible man because I'm such an awesome dude and so woke I am, right? As if in 100 or 300 years people won't vilify me for all the ridiculous things I did. I knew that gasoline was warming the earth and I continued to drive an automobile. I walked by homeless people, 3 of them, on the way to this panel and did exactly nothing. Look, I'm not trying to equate that with being a slave owner in the 1710s, but I do think that there should be a little less hubris in these discussions and a little more awareness of just how much all of us will suck. All of us.
So the answer is they renamed the award.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. It's the Rizzo Prize now, yeah.
Yeah.
Strangely, yeah.
This young woman, yeah.
Panelists, you've talked a lot about how you would make a decision to remove or topple or take down or erase some sort of monument. But what about the criteria for actually erecting a new monument? And when you think about all the various ways that you can document something that happened in history or commemorate something, when is a monument justified, and when can it actually, that powerful symbolism become more destructive rather than something that's productive?
Well, so let's see. So I think that's a really good, complicated question. So in Monument Lab, we actually collected 5,000 ideas from people about what they would like and how they think we should go about making decisions. And so what we have, and so we're influenced by all the ideas that have been coming in, but we have a mural. Our projects happen many different ways. One way is that we have a mural application, and people make a case for what they want. And I would say an inordinate amount of people want portraiture. It's one of the more popular motifs. That's what people suggest. So it is always a robust debate about who gets represented and who does the representing, right? So, but I think often in communities that have felt underrepresented, that I think it's important that people go up on walls. I don't think it should be just a city filled with landscapes, right, or abstract work. I think the people are an important part of this collection. And so we try really hard to make sure that there's a real consensus around who's going up and why they're going up. And so, we want to challenge people on the front end so that months later, years later, there's not, why did we do that? How did that decision get made? So transparency is absolutely key. I'm not saying that, and it's never an easy, it's not like there's one way of doing this. Now, we were hoping that the research that we gathered, and we had people at Penn culling through all this data, and so we have a really thick report, that it would influence public art policy in the city when they decide to do monuments. Like, how are those decisions made, and will people's suggestions and ideas be heard in any way? And so we've presented our case, we've talked to the mayor, we've met with 80 different commissioners and deputy commissioners, we've met with city council, and we've presented the data and the findings across the board with the hopes, look, things are very incremental in life in general, that we can start to plant seeds about how we start to think about public art making in public space and what does that even mean today.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
I think that you bring up an interesting point, which is that,
Sorry,
and
I
we'll
was
probably
long-winded.
end soon, that maybe one of the ways to deal with these monuments we want to take down is really more to put up monuments of the people who had, and this was your original point, put up monuments of
You
the,
told me we'd get
we've
back
come
to
full
it. You
circle.
told me, promised.
To put up the monuments of the people that were not represented so that we have, because as Jonathan said, we don't even know what the blind spots are in our own landscape now, what it is that we're missing, that we're not doing, that are going to be vilified a generation from now. And I think that should humble us.
Oh, and one other thing I just want to say, because I have to get this point in, that we have to think like the process of creating the work is monumental as well. So
and educational.
And educational. So you should go to the Municipal Services Building and see the giant portraits of people in our program called the Guild for people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system that wraps around these beautiful, beautiful portraits that were created by our students. And the process of creating it, they felt like we are part of creating history, creating a monument, like it was a monumental impact on them. So I sometimes think we look at the object without thinking about the power of process. Because that reclamation of space is so important and inspiring.
Having done it yourself.
And the debates are themselves educational, and it worries me that if we steer away from controversial figures, we won't have the debates. So I just read an article that counted or documented school naming. And the takeaway of the article was that until the 80s, schools were named after people, and now they're named after landscapes. You know, Whistling Pines, right? Because God forbid we name it after some dude that somebody doesn't like a generation from now, and then there's like a big controversy. But those discussions are hugely educational, and we will lose them if we try to skirt the controversy.
I think we should also notice monuments that are done by people who don't have power, or people who
That's
have
right.
chosen. So in music, in folk tale, in story, there's so many ways that I just...
Right, and one of
There are
my
people
favorite
with hands
murals,
up, I don't
it's
wanna
the
speak
Wall
up.
of Neighborhood Heroes in Norris Square. Because people were like, wait a minute, all these like fancy people get statues and murals and like that's Dr. J, but what about the women in the community who change things? And we're like, you are right. And every time, it's a really old mural and it was painted with like house paint, but I like love it because it's like what it captures is so important.
One more question, and then I think we'll wrap up. Yes.
I'd like to get the panelists' opinion on a hypothetical, given the more contemporaneous issue. Bill Cosby has a strong relationship with Philadelphia, Temple University, as I understand it. So let's say that I come in and I say, hey, I'd like to talk about having him memorialized in the city. I'd like to know what your thoughts on that would be. As someone who grew up watching Fat Albert and grew up watching the Cosby Show and not knowing any of what was going on with him in his own life.
And I Spy, don't forget I Spy.
I Spy, yes.
I Spy, remember I Spy.
Wow.
I loved I Spy.
Okay.
I wanted controversy, but not that much. Like let's go easy.
And what about having our children and grandchildren watch the Cosby Show? I mean,
I think that's a separate question.
that's a separate
related,
question
but
from.
yours is harder and more important. It's not that one isn't. That has its own. I mean,
I take
but-
it back. But what is your answer to that question, Jonathan?
Well, Temple has tried to sever its connection to Cosby. I mean, I think people can debate the timing of that, right? They can debate the way it did that, but Temple has absolutely attempted to separate itself from him with whatever success you might judge. But look, I don't think that there's any reason to celebrate Bill Cosby, but there's also no reason to wish him away. It happened, all of it, all of his brilliance and all of his perfidy. All of it happened. And I don't think we should have like a nice big statue in the middle of a town square to Bill Cosby. But I also don't think that he should be ignored or say removed from like displays like in the Smithsonian's African American History Museum, right, where they have other great entertainers. Bill Cosby is an absolutely central figure in the history of American entertainment, you know, and nothing he did, and he did really bad things, changes that fact. And I think we should be able to say both things.
I think it's the Wagner question.
It is.
It's
yeah.
the work
is.
he created and himself. Now, it does make you think about that work and maybe see things differently.
But we had a request. A request came in. Someone wanted a Bill Cosby mural, and felt like, you know, he had been sort of, this was unfairly treated. It was this is going back some years, but information was coming out, and so we posed it to the community, and there was a difficult conversation, and people decided to not move forward. But that's essentially what you just said. That was in the community meeting.
Do you think the timing is part of it too? That now it's too raw, and that at a future time there would be possibly a different perspective? I mean, perhaps we can't see it now because we are within this time.
Possibly,
but I mean, now to put up a memorial would seem impossible.
But
right? Yeah.
That's a very important question, ma'am. How long should you wait to memorialize an event or an individual for some of the reasons that you just stated?
Right.
That's right. If we ever have a monument, a historical monument to the Me Too movement in Philadelphia, I'd like a statue of Bill Cosby to be there, properly contextualized, because I don't think you'll really be able to understand Me Too in Philadelphia without thinking about Bill Cosby. I think he's a central figure in it.
I don't know if Me Too would be best done by statues.
Right. I mean, again,
you know what I mean?
Right. You're the artist. Yeah.
And once you
a video installation.
Yeah, an installation.
You put a big slab of rock someplace.
Yeah.
That does different things.
Yes.
From a performance, an installation, something. You know what Brian Stevenson's museum does.
The one about
Justice. Of lynching. It has to do an abstraction, but it's a way to talk about lynching, just like when you talked about the textbook, you know, the photos that show the flag in Harlem. A man was lynched today. Or
do you think that perhaps we've moved out of a mode of the individual being the hero, so to speak? We've moved into a narrative form where we won't make monuments for individuals, because individuals are going to be so mixed and so flawed, as we now see. We don't think in terms of people being purely heroic anymore. It's a different mindset. So our monuments will be of a different nature. They will be more, they will tell stories in a way that the individual on the horse, it does tell a kind of story, but is really about a presumably flawless hero. And this is a different paradigm from the one.
Right. I would say that now I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, even though I said there was a lot of power in portraiture, that I would say we try to push people when their first instinct is we'd like a portrait of someone, like why, and what do they represent, and can we get deeper and understand it?
What's the story?
Yeah.
So I want to thank everybody. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you.
And I hope we have more of these, and I hope we can do more here at this wonderful venue. And thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such an honor to meet you.